we're talking about an introduction to clauses here. And when you're thinking of clauses, the important thing to remember about clauses is that, unlike phrases, clauses are going to be the largest part of speech that you're going to be dealing with other than sentences. All parts of a sentence are contained within a clause. If you have two clauses, a subordinate clause and an independent clause, all the words in the sentence are going to be part of one clause or another. So in that respect, it's very different than a phrase, which is a smaller piece of a sentence. A clause is going to be a very large part of a sentence. Okay, that being said, what defines a clause and what separates it from a phrase is that a phrase does not contain both a verb and its subject. It is a related group of words, just like a clause. It can act like an adjective. It can act like a noun. It can act like an adverb. Both groups of words can do this. The difference is that a clause has a verb and a subject, and a phrase does not. Now, if you have a verb phrase, it will have no nouns in it. If you have a prepositional phrase, an infinitive phrase, or a participial phrase, all of them, they do not contain a verb. Even though for an infinitive phrase and a participial phrase, you have a verb form, you have a verb that's acting like something else. Nevertheless, it doesn't count as a verb. Okay, so let's look at two different types of clauses here. Now, an independent clause is one that expresses a complete thought and can stand by itself as a sentence. Simple sentences are independent clauses. Students have to remember this, that when they're trying to identify a clause in a sentence and there doesn't seem to be a second verb in the sentence, the entire sentence is an independent clause. So that's one of the things that you look for when you're dealing with clauses is there a second verb in the sentence? And is it acting like a verb? Because participial phrases and infinitives, they will throw you off. Now, subordinate clause, it does not express a complete thought. It cannot stand by itself. And this is important. Often, the best way to determine if something is a subordinate clause is to say it out loud. And imagine someone saying it to you, and if it doesn't sound like it makes sense, well then it's not a subordinate clause. Now this is something else to remember. If a subordinate clause does appear by itself, it is considered a fragment. It needs an independent clause to be a valid grammatical construction. Alright, so let's look at a couple of independent clauses. I can say, let's go to a pen here. My goodness. I laugh. Right. Simple subject, verb. This is very important, right? Because that's all that needs to be an independent clause. This is not only an independent clause, it is also a sentence in its own right. So, let's look at a subordinate clause. So we have begin, a subordinate clause. A subordinate clause always begins with some type of, either begins with a subordinate conjunction or a relative pronoun. And you will be able to identify them in time with the next two lectures on adjective clauses and adverb clauses. Nevertheless, let's start with something very simple so you can see it in action. Because she laughed. Alright, again, and of course we don't want the verb, and we don't want the period there because by itself, this is a fragment. If someone came up to you and said, because she laughed, you would say, well, why did she laugh? What happened? But the critical thing is to remember is that we have a subject and we have a verb. So this is clearly a clause, but because we have the subordinating conjunction in front of it, it will not work by its own. Now, you can combine them, and suddenly you have a pretty neat construction. I laughed because she laughed. That works out just fine. We can also move the subordinate clause to the beginning, which is a nice thing about clauses. Because she laughed, I laughed. Now, this is the critical thing to remember about moving clauses around. When you have a subordinate clause before an independent clause, there is going to be a comma there. And And that is a very important thing to remember, especially if you're trying to find them in the sentence. And you said, oh ho, okay, look, we have laughed and laughed, two verbs, but there's a comma separating the two. Well, that's a pretty good indication that this is the subordinate clause and that this is the independent clause. Now, if you have, clear all these away, if you want to move them back, if the independent clause comes first and is followed by a subordinate clause, there will not be a comma. Saying that, there is one case where there will be, but this is a very isolated case. When you have the word which brings a comma to the party. Even when the subordinate clause is second, you will almost always have a comma with which. And that's because generally which is used for what we call non-essential clauses. We will get into that in a later presentation. But needless to say, if you see which and there's an independent clause in front of it, or an independent clause, and as in this case, is surrounding it, you can take out the term which produces the lifeblood for teaching, and you see that it is interrupting this independent clause. The espresso machine is on the coffee shrine in the corner. That's the independent clause. The subordinate clause is stuck right in the middle of it, which produces the lifeblood for teaching. Now, even in this clause, we have produces, and which is acting like the subject in this case. Nevertheless, it still counts as a subordinate clause because it begins with the subordinating conjunction. All right, let's look at another one. Okay. The cabinet that contains all my lesson plans is very important to me. All right, here we have another subordinate clause that's stuck right in the middle of independent clause, but because we're not using the term which, there is no comma there. So we have the independent clause, the cabinet is very important to me. So you can see they kind of, jump over the subordinate clause. And that subordinate clause, that contains all my lesson plans. We still have subject, verb, subject, verb. It is clearly a clause in its own right, but yet because if I walked up to you and said, that contains all my lesson plans, and it's not acting like a demonstrative pronoun, well, that sentence doesn't make any sense on its own. Therefore, it cannot stand alone. If I said that just by itself, it would be a fragment. All right, let's look at another example here. And this is an important moment or lesson I want you to learn. Not all things that begin clauses will make them subordinate. There is a construction, serious construction, called coordinating conjunctions. And let's look in there. And this is the acronym that you're going to want to remember. Fanboys. So it's for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Alright, so whenever you have a coordinated conjunction that follows a comma, and there is a clause on either side, which we have here, we attempted to share the conch, Ralph would never let it go. Both of these are independent clauses. They can both stand alone. Ralph would never let it go. That sounds fine on its own. We attempted to share the conch. That sounds fine on its own. They're both independent clauses. This construction is called a compound sentence. And we will get to it, don't worry. But the thing I want you to remember is that when you have comma plus a coordinated conjunction, comma plus coordinating conjunction, you're going to be dealing with two independent clauses. This does not make Ralph would never let it go a subordinating conjunction. It does not. Subordinating conjunctions are formed by subordinating conjunctions. Subordinate clauses are formed by subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns. Okay, let's look at how we can manipulate a sentence to make it either independent clauses or subordinate clauses. Right? Since at the moment we have, since I love teaching, I enjoy learning new things. Now we can make this a straight up subordinate clause and independent clause, and you can see here it's missing something, which like, oh yes, of course, it is missing the comma. So let's put in the comma right there because we have the subordinate clause first, independent clause second. We need that comma. All right, let's try it with without moving with the independent clause first. I enjoy learning new things since I love teaching. Right. Now, this is a subordinating conjunction. It will make this sentence a subordinating clause, right? Now, if we wanted to, we could take it out and add in a coordinating conjunction, and we can make these two independent clauses. So if I said, I enjoy learning new things, comma, and I love teaching, that works, comma, so I enjoy learning new things, so I love teaching, or yet, which is somewhat sarcastic, I enjoy learning new things, yet I love teaching. That does sound like they aren't related. It's however you wish to put it, stylistically, whatever message you want to bring across. The point that I want to bring across to you, though, is that when you have a coordinating conjunction combining two clauses, that makes them independent clauses. If you have a subordinating conjunction, that would make this an entire subordinating clause. You can even add it here. Since I enjoy learning new things, I love teaching. It works either way. Okay, let's do a quick recap. First off, independent clauses and subordinate clauses are going to contain every word in the sentence. Every word in the sentence is going to be in one clause or another. Second thing, independent clauses can stand on their own. They can be a sentence in their own right. Subordinate clauses cannot. When you have a subordinate clause by itself, it is considered to be a fragment. Third, when you have a subordinating clause before an independent clause, there needs to be a comma separating the two of them. When you have the independent clause before the subordinating clause, there will not be a comma unless you're dealing with the subordinating conjunction which we will get to when we hit adjective phrases. And lastly, when you have a coordinating conjunction, something that's called something in the fanboys acronym, when you have a coordinating conjunction that is combining two clauses, those two clauses are going to be independent. Okay.